Hello everybody, I'm Gwen Campbell-Mindes and welcome to Books My Dad, who's a PhD in English literature, thinks I should read because reading them improves my understanding of good literature, also known as Gwen aimlessly chatters about real literature. So this was technically the last book on the list. I had held off on what will be my actual last video in this series because that was a book that it's a very, very short book. It's actually a novella, not an actual novel. And I had been holding off on that in case I was ever in a corner and needed something I could literally read in an hour and punch out a video on. So, this is the end of the list, and if you have been paying attention, you will note that this has been largely in alphabetical order. That was just the order that my father gave these books to me in. They were in alphabetical order, and I saw no reason to play around with it, so I just read it in the order it was given. I will also add that this is obviously not an exhaustive list of all great literary books in everything ever. This was just a list of books that a well-read person probably ought to have read. So that's where we are. And I'm not entirely certain how I feel about this one. This one being Kurt Vonnegut's Deadeye Dick. This a moving fable. Vonnegut, sweet, cynic, and ugly duckling, continues to write gentle swan songs for our uncivil society. It's an oddly apt statement that, at least a great deal more apt than the Mom's Favorites blurb that they had stuck onto the Air affair, which seems to be trying to compare that to Buffy the Vampire Slayer and Monty Python and Harry Potter simultaneously, which, honestly, the book is barely anything like any of those things. So, Deadeye Dick. It's kind of just a story about how our beginnings kind of create the rest of our lives. It's kind of very, very much about that, because he starts this book by describing, the narrator rather begins by describing how his father came to be who he was, and it's basically a description about how the indulgence and beliefs of the narrator's grandparents, how those affected the narrator's father, and how his father came to be kind of a ne'er-do-well, that he was, a drinker and a whole bunch of other things, and a man who sort of saw himself as an artist and saw himself as good with children, even though he was nothing of the sort. And how this man, with his fundamental self-deception and everything, then wound up raising two children who were also very sincerely and negatively affected by all sorts of things, including the narrator, his youngest son, who he gave his youngest son the keys to the gun room upstairs. This wealthy man who was able to afford to have a gun room, he gave his son the keys to this, and children are not the most responsible people. And so his son went upstairs and said, haha, this is my domain, and picked up a gun and just fired a single shot up into the air. And that shot that he just had fired into the air, not aimed at anybody, not intending anything, wound up killing a young woman, a pregnant woman. And at the end of all of this, that one act, which was at least partly the fault of his father giving his youngest son this responsibility that he clearly wasn't ready for, affects the rest of his life. He spends the rest of his life celibate and single, and he winds up becoming a pharmacist. And because he's so socially isolated, because of the fallout of that, it affects who he is and how he acts and who he is with other people. And the whole book just, it's a constant refrain, a constant cycling back to where he's from. And there are parts in this that I have no doubt are about human nature and everything else, but the big thing that I'm getting from this, that I got out of this book, was that no matter what you do or where you go or how you struggle, to quote Darla from an episode of Buffy the Vampire Slayer, everything who we are informs who we become. Every experience that he has makes him into who he is by the end of the book. And that who he is at the end of the book has his good sides and its downsides, but it all stems directly from his father and his father's massive impact on how he saw the world, and from that one incident in his childhood which left him isolated and alone because of what was in effect an accident, because he didn't shoot the gun at anybody. He didn't shoot it with an intention of harming anyone. He just fired the gun into the air, which, I mean, is a thing people should never do. You know, because bullets are traveling at extremely high speeds, which means you fire them into the air. By the time the bullet slows down enough to turn around and head back to Earth, it's going to have sped right back up again to terminal velocity and will probably hurt somebody if that bullet lands on that person. So firing a gun is usually not that great an idea if you're going to fire it randomly, even if you think you're firing it in some way that nobody would possibly be hurt. The fact is that unless you are firing a gun at a specific target, you're taking a risk that you're going to hurt somebody simply by virtue of, you know, the power of what guns are. And the thing about this is the book was fine. It was readable enough. You know, you've got some conceptually interesting stuff going on, but I don't think it's really to my taste. I didn't find it actively funny. It was just a little bit wry in places, as opposed to being genuinely funny, at least to me. You know, I can see where it is intended to be funny, and I can see how some people would find it funny. I personally did not. I mostly just found it there. I think this may be this book may be really, really very much a matter of taste. I cannot for the life of me find things to say, because there's not a lot of plot in this book. You know, you have this boy who grows up into a pharmacist, and things happen in the course of his life, but they don't have a unison, they don't have a driving force, they don't have a plot to them. And in that way, oddly enough, they do feel more like the story of a life, in that it doesn't feel like it's going anywhere. It's just things that happen to people. Because, I mean, that's life. Life is a bunch of things that happen to people. And some of those things are self-inflicted, and some of those things are externally inflicted. But it's just a series of events. It's not as though there is, in fact, a plot. And if you are one of those people who believes that there is some sort of a plot, well, good for you. But it's not a plot that is perceptible to the average person. So I am a little bit at a loss in terms of talking about this one, because nothing really exciting happens. You know, you have these fits and starts where the narrator will talk about, I don't remember his name. I'm not going to go to the effort of digging it out, because I mean, our narrator, who winds up with the nickname Deadeye Dick because one of the police officers involved in the process of his detention, and who wound up driving him home after he had been detained for what was in effect not even manslaughter. It was a clear accidental death. But his father, who could have, not wound up in prison, was a very melodramatic sort who got himself thrown in prison by being in an absolute ecstasy of self-flagellation in public, which our narrator Deadeye Dick says was sort of his father's self-deceptive belief that if he was just dramatic enough in, saying things about in appearing, sorry for whatever had happened, that, that would be everything. I have made my public apology and so on, and clearly everything will go away. And his father was in such an ecstasy of doing this that he managed to get himself thrown in prison instead of making everything go away. And I don't know. I can't really think. There are plot points. There are things that happen, but it kind of feels pointless, which may be the point, of course. I mean, this whole book starts after the explosion of a neutron bomb. Now, the thing about the neutron bomb is that there was at one point in history a sort of a thing that went around about the idea of this bomb that would go off and it would basically evaporate all the people in a given area, all the living people and animals and possibly the plants in a given area, and they would just all evaporate, leaving a city entirely empty and ready for people to just sort of, waltz in and take over, that there would be nothing left. And I mean, it's an interesting concept, but matter and energy do not in fact work that way. So it, wouldn't work. But it's an interesting conceit, and this book sort of starts at the end, with the neutron bomb having gone off and the news reaching our narrator, Deadeye Dick, and his brother, where they have opened up a hotel in Haiti. And then it sort of backtracks through his life and back up to where the book, started. And, and there's so many strange little bits in this. Like, at the end of the book, one of their Haitian employees offers to, raise a ghost for them in their hometown in the U.S., and so he raises a ghost in Midland City because he can, as a favor, and so they raise the ghost of a World War I pilot who was buried there. So now it's a city haunted by a World War I pilot. And it's just a thing that happens, and it's strange, and there's a lot of randomness in this book, and an odd sense of comfortable resignation, of not sad resignation. This isn't a life sucks and then you die sort of book, which many of these have been. Many of the books on this list, rather. But I don't know. This is a book that I have come out of, and all I can say about this in the end is I just don't know. So, on that note, I think I'm going to wrap this up, and in a few weeks we will have the last book of this particular run, and then I will probably try to do some change-ups in some of the things that I'm doing. But anyways, that's everything. So I guess I will see you all next week.